Okay, so basically, at the very heart of any gifted program is going to be, let's get every student to meet their fullest potential, to find the best version of themselves. And what we know is that a gifted student at a high SES school is going to look much different than a gifted student from a low SES school, just on average. That kid from a underprivileged economic background is going to need more resources to pull them up and help them find the best within themselves, because there are a lot of obstacles that the typical average student just is not going to have to overcome. First and foremost of those obstacles is just the idea of persistent poverty. Persistent poverty in everyday life is going to put negative stress on more stressors than any kid is going to want to deal with. If we were to look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, starting from the bottom with everyday physiological needs to the top being those psychological, emotional, social needs, even though those bottom needs, as far as hunger, safety, those perhaps are not being met or are being questioned on an everyday basis when you live in persistent poverty. A kid is not going to come into school worrying about how he scores on an Algebra 2 test or whether or not he's labeled gifted if his belly is hungry, and we know that to be true. The insecurity that poverty brings is going to negatively impact certainly our attempt to help this kid reach their fullest potential. What we also know is that typically in any rural school, much less a low SES rural school, we're going to have lower populations of people because our job foundational base is not there. That's going to bring with it a lower tax base. That's going to bring lower funding into schools. That's going to bring less resources, worse resources, and unfortunately, teachers are a resource. So we're going to have a problem getting good qualified teachers into rural schools. And unfortunately, that means that the kids who need awesome teachers the most, our poor rural students, are going to have the hardest time finding great teachers. And because let's face it, the best of the best teachers follow money and they follow job difficulty. They go to where the easiest, best of the best students often are. So our low SES, poor rural kids get left with oftentimes sort of non-qualified skills to deal with gifted kids, much less gifted kids who are dealing with perhaps the socio economic, psychological, all the other needs that come from poverty difficulties. We also have an issue that I read in literature called a brain drain, which is impacting our rural communities. And I found this fascinating. This is the idea that when you do have a kid who actually makes it, who goes through, graduates from college, goes to a 4-year, gets a 4-year degree. Now he is a polished citizen ready to give back to the U.S. workforce. Statistically speaking, he is not going to come back to where he came from. He's not going to come back to his rural upbringing. As much as we want to talk about these kids valuing community, the ones that go off to college don't value community enough to actually bring their diploma back to where they came from. They're going to go to a larger urban area somewhere and become part of the community there. How do we get these kids to, if they do break the cycle of poverty, if they do go on to, they've developed a tool. They can show our younger kids, how do you go through high school, how do you go through college, and how do you equip yourself to be economically successful, academically successful. They bring that tool to another community. When we want them to bring it back here to start their own family, start their own cycle of success instead of a cycle of poverty. What we have left in our rural communities is a cycle of poverty. It's families that fail to graduate high school, certainly don't go to college. They beget families who fail to graduate high school, certainly fail to graduate college, and the cycle of poverty continues. I've had so many kids who they just know they're not going to graduate because their mom and daddy didn't graduate, their mom and daddy don't graduate. how do you break this cycle? They certainly don't value education. These are not kids running home to show mama what they got on their report card. Maybe their friend group will belittle them if they value education too much. And this is just a hard part of this problem to solve. Also, another issue that we know inside gifted education in terms of SES students is that they are underrepresented in their gifted programs. If I have a rich school, poor school, I am just as likely in either school to have a gifted program. The problem is my rich school is going to have more students than my poor school. Just statistically speaking, this is true. Now, this becomes a nature versus nurture question for me. Are these rich kids, by their very nature, are they more genetically predispositioned to be brighter and smarter? And I don't think so. It becomes then a question of nurture. It becomes what has happened to these kids in a low SES community that has kept them from actually becoming and being labeled academically gifted. And so how do we fix for this? How do we put this into the equation? So how do we fix underrepresentation in our underrepresented groups? Now, what the research says that we have a few ways. Number one, stop relying on referrals for gifted programs. If we leave it up to teachers, to guidance counselors, and to parents to refer kids into these programs, then inside low SES communities, we're going to get an underrepresentation every time, because even inside those communities, you are far less likely to be reported as gifted. Even your own mama is less likely to say that you're gifted if you're from a poor community. So get rid of referrals. If we do have referrals and then testing, let us norm those test grades to be backed by cutoff scores that are more in line with district and school levels. Perhaps also, if we're gonna rely on referrals, let us train our teachers, guidance counselors, and even parents to see those diamonds in the rough, to see those gifted kids who are just being overcome by circumstantial life factors. And then finally, universal testing seems to be very appropriate. Test every kid for giftedness, and you're bound to find more gifted kids. Thank you so very much.